I finished 2018's God of War recently, and I think it's time for a retrospective on it. See, video game storytelling is very different to storytelling in a book or a film, which we've usually focused on this channel. God of War is an interesting case study in the limitations of storytelling in the video game medium, and how to address those challenges. This game has languished in unadulterated praise as one of the best narrative-driven games for years, and that's totally deserved. But I do want to offer a different angle of critique that some of this discourse may have missed, both in my criticisms and my praise for things that others may not have highlighted. To be clear though, God of War is a fantastic game with compelling characters, their arcs, and a beautiful world. But me repeating all of that to you, especially when you've heard it all before in Joseph Anderson's fully comprehensive 3-hour-long critique, do go watch that, wouldn't be all that valuable. I wouldn't be contributing much. So let's get to it. And this video is brought to you by my magical patrons, whose support genuinely makes this and my other writing and world-building content possible. They allow me to make these longer-form critiques and take the time to do them. If you'd like to join the Discord, chat with us about all this kind of stuff with just a couple of bucks a month, please do so at the link down below. Looking forward to having you. But I refuse to surrender my channel to negativity, so we are going to start with the things that the game does amazingly well in both its world building and its narrative as a game, and we're going to do it with the help of my amazing friends Red and Blue from Overly Sarcastic Productions.
Hi Tim, thanks so much for having us.
As avid God of War fans and professional mythology nerds, we are hyped to talk about this game with you.
We'll leave the major analysis to you, but we'll jump back in later to talk mythology and world building.
Thanks guys. Now, for those unfamiliar with the story of God of War, I am going to spoil all of it. So, you've been warned, back out now, experience the game for yourself, and then come back. But I want to give you a quick summary to give you some context to work with. So, Kratos, a Greek god of, you guessed it, war, has ventured away from his homeland of Sparta to find peace after a long vengeance quest against the Greek gods, whom he killed. And during that happy adventure, he also killed a bunch of people who weren't Greek gods, who were just bystanders, living their lives. Basically, he did a lot of killing in games 1 to 3. That was the thing. Now, arriving in the lands of Norse mythology, called Midgard, but likely Scandinavia, Kratos has found love with a woman called Faye, and they have a son called Atreus. The game opens with Faye's death, and Kratos taking on the responsibility of caring for his son alone, which he's not very good at.
What are you doing? Now his guard is up. Only fire. Only fire when I tell you to fire.
They have a typical godly family relationship at the start, by which I mean terrible. Faye's last request was to have her ashes scattered at the highest mountain peak in all the 9 realms, so Atreus and Kratos set out to do exactly this. And just like every adventure in ancient mythology, it falls apart within the first few pages. There's another Norse god hunting him down for reasons he doesn't understand, the world serpent Jormungandr turns out to be a pretty chill dude, and in very Greek fashion, you get unwillingly caught up in a story because the gods decided to be dicks. But, in the end, Kratos and Atreus get through it and have a very uncharacteristically non-Greek happy ending, and they are finally given the catharsis of scattering Faye's ashes. And honestly, that's it. This was the first thing that stuck out to me about God of War as a video game narrative. Part 1. An old story told well. Now, there have been 1,000 stories of 2 radically different characters going on a physical journey through which they change personally and come to understand one another. To go further than this, one of them is often a darker, more experienced character who needs to open up and trust, while the other is more innocent and naive and needs to mature with a more nuanced understanding of the world. Well, that's exactly what it is. We'll call this the journey story for the video. The journey story was used as recently as in the Sam Mendes masterpiece 1917, with William Schofield being the wizened character and Tom Blake being the more naive one. The film was oddly enough even criticized and praised for how it looked and functioned like a video game. But it's also been a common trope in films like Logan, and obviously, this is the narrative paradigm for God of War. A simple story of a father and son learning to bond over shared struggles, where Kratos learns to open up and trust, while Atreus matures to how the world works, changing each other and themselves, all with a very simple goal: to fulfill the final wish of someone they both loved. See, one challenge with video game storytelling is just how much time you can dedicate to character development and exposition. Hideo Kojima certainly pushed the limits with this with Death Stranding, and up to 40-minute cutscenes at a time. But there's a reason that this game catered to a more niche community. Complex stories with a large cast of characters, unusual character arcs, and complex character goals that require backstory and exposition about the world are a lot more difficult to tell in the video game medium. Not impossible, but certainly more of a challenge when you don't have pages and pages to take your time through the complexity. To show you what I mean, the finished God of War script is only 45,000 words, and that includes lengthy descriptions of all the cutscenes, titles for the scenes, and notes on how things should be said. For context, that's 15,000 words shorter than your average young adult novel, and those are short books. Your average adult fantasy novel is anywhere between 120 and 300,000 words. The director for God of War, Cory Barlog, seemed to recognize this limitation and instead chose to tell a very simple story well. The character goals and world don't require much exposition for the player to understand why they are doing things, and the very limited cast of the mains Kratos and Atreus, but also the secondaries Freya and Mimir, allowed Barlog to instead dedicate as much of the script as possible to their meaningful character development. It avoids the pitfall of spending half of your script explaining the story and the world around them to your audience just to help it make sense, leaving the characters relatively paper thin. Other video game writers seem to have taken up on this similar method. Over the last decade, some of the highest rated story-driven games have been developed with a similar journey premise. The Last of Us by Neil Druckmann, Firewatch by Sean Vanneman, and Bioshock Infinite by Ken Levine. These games all use that archetypal journey story of just two radically different characters learning from and understanding one another as they go on a physical journey. More often than not, with one naive character in the dynamic being a child. A friend of mine, Sage Hayden, over at Just Right, referred to this as the daddening of video games. Now, the journey story isn't the only framework that works for good stories in video games, but the fact that it is so common should be a testament to how these games meet the limitations of the medium. God of War's story worked because it was written recognizing the limitations of the medium, but also because it heavily uses what we'll call preconditioning. There's another reason that the journey story works so well for games. By creating Atreus as a child and placing us in the shoes of a father figure, we're already conditioned to care for and protect the other character. Building on this, given we play as the character who does most of the fighting in the actual gameplay, the player is an active participant in Kratos' motivations to protect Atreus, with him often placed in positions of danger. The writers effectively use the medium of gameplay to give us the foundation for this relationship and facilitate its growth. These simple stories use the familiar relationship dynamic to make it easy to become attached to the characters they create. This isn't a particularly complex emotion to feel, but it's very real, and it's very relatable for someone to step into the shoes of. Building on this, a major part of their relationship developing is their growing trust of one another. Barlog chose to open with the death of Atreus' mother and gives us the simple task of scattering the mother's ashes. This is a very simple and down-to-earth objective to give the player, one that some players may have even participated in themselves in real life. Though this world is fantastical and full of colour and wonder, we already have preconditioned thoughts and emotions and feelings about the actual substance of what we're doing and why. And to help with this, the character arcs of Kratos and Atreus also use the immediately familiar in this archetypal journey structure. Atreus wanting his father to trust him as he grows is something that we all go through, and him wanting Kratos to be the father that he always needed is a sad reality that a lot of people have to deal with. And even if you don't, it's easy to understand what the lack of that kind of father figure would do to you. Similarly, Kratos' arc of allowing yourself to feel and to grieve is something that a lot of people struggle with, especially men, who would be the predominant target audience of the game. And the struggle of handling guilt and being open about your past is a familiar one. And the game frames this by never really dwelling that much on the godlike past of what he did and how horrible it was. Just the grief and emotions that come from that. It's all very, really grounded. Fundamentally, by using the familiar and simple starting points for character arcs and player objectives, the writer can dedicate more time to deepening the emotions around them and the dynamics that they have, than games where the player isn't preconditioned to understand what it means or how it feels to be in the position that the character is. For example, in the game Remember Me, they spend a lot of early game time dedicated to explaining that this is a world where memories can be altered, how this happens, that yours have been taken, and encouraging you to care about your memories being stolen. It's an unfamiliar world and kind of dynamic, but it is probably a traumatic experience. It just takes a little bit longer for us to care about that, which means they get less time developing her as a character. But familiarity also comes from structure. How a story is structured tells the reader or player here on a metatextual level what to care about, what is important. And the game relies on a very clear and familiar, simple 3-act structure. The first act ends arriving at the lake roughly 22% of the way through, the midpoint ends with Mimir roughly 44% of the way through, the second act ends with the destruction of the Jotunheim portal at about 80% of the way through, and the third act ends at the scattering of the ashes, about 100% of the way through. The structure gives an easy context in which the players can understand what they're experiencing, clearly signaling what's important and what's not. All of the major story beats are structured around Kratos and Atreus' father-son relationship and Kratos' struggle to trust him with the truth of his godhood and his past. Structurally, the biggest story beats aren't their conflict with Baldur, despite him being the main antagonist, but Atreus confronting his father about how he neglects him, and Kratos revealing that he is in fact a god, as well as the fact that he killed innocents in his past. The build-up, flow, and release of tension in the structure of the narrative is all based around that relationship. I'd be tempted to say that they didn't introduce Thor or Odin because they didn't want us focusing on them. They didn't want the focus of the game to be about the struggle between two gods. Once again, its focus isn't on being unique, but on doing something familiar very well. All of this is deliberately crafted to help us empathize with the characters, and the catharsis comes at the end when you finally reach Jotunheim and scatter the ashes together. It's well earned, but more importantly, it's very emotionally deep. It's a simple but powerful kind of moment. Just as much as preconditioning is used to make you care about what you're doing in God of War, they also use gameplay to reinforce these narrative elements, which is fantastic. The best example of this is how at the start, Kratos doesn't even trust Atreus to carry his mother's ashes, but as the story progresses, he comes to trust and depend on him more.
Carry her.
The creators chose to reflect this in how you play. Atreus' ability to stun enemies becomes incredibly valuable, even vital, in combat, and he plays crucial roles in helping you take down enemies and bosses. I remember one time trying to kill this damn dark elf boss, and it took me so much longer than any other boss, even Baldur, and I only just survived by spamming Atreus' bow and arrows before he killed me. A moment longer, and I would have died. In a sense, I was genuinely thankful for Atreus being there and helping me, even though I knew on a metatextual level that it was me making him do that. See, suspension of belief made me thankful for Atreus. You literally trust him more in how you play. There's a distinctive pairing between narrative and gameplay here, and the mechanics function in a kind of Pavlovian way, rewarding you for doing exactly what the designers want, which is learning to rely on Atreus in the same way we are told Kratos comes to rely on him in the narrative. This is a brilliant way to address one major challenge with gameplay storytelling, where you give the player agency. There can be a ludonarrative dissonance between what the story says your character is like and how the player believes them to be, how they actually play. Here, they incentivize you to play in a way that prevents any dissonance like that from ever happening. And perhaps the reverse of this though, the game also conditions you to feel frustrated with Atreus when he goes on a bit of a power trip in the story. To match this, he stops obeying your commands without any real warning, which was a rude awakening for me when it got me killed because he wasn't stunning enemies when I told him. This section does have some pretty cringe dialogue, but it's not the worst thing in the world, and it's certainly not the worst dialogue I've heard in a video game.
Show yourself! Our new ruler, the Emperor! Friends, it is not over yet.
Is that all you have to say?
And on the topic of gameplay and narrative integration, there were also some pretty awkward moments, some of which were really jarring. There's this strange mechanic where Baldur pins you down and you have to dodge either side and then strike out at him. The controls are pretty odd, and they weren't super intuitive to figure out in this moment of supposedly super high tension, where Atreus has been taken by Baldur. This happened at the end of the second act of the story, which is meant to be the darkest point for our characters, where Kratos has had to face up to his past in the Blades of Chaos, and Atreus even turns on you completely. This is meant to be a highly emotional moment where you're desperately trying to get back to your son despite your difficulties, but I couldn't get a grip of these controls, which might just be #you're a noob, Tim, if that's so, type it in the comments, but I ended up in this repetitive loop of him thumping down at me for like a minute straight. I was so focused on figuring out exactly what the game wanted me to do here that I couldn't really get into the story part of this. And it was clear that Baldur wasn't going to kill me, so it lost any sort of feeling of danger or any impact. Clunky gameplay controls killed the pacing of the scene. Joseph Anderson, as a more experienced gamer, talks a bit more of this from his perspective, but this was my experience. Despite this criticism, God of War is a simple story told extremely well that doesn't just work within the limitations of the medium, but actively uses those limitations to make the narrative more interesting and immersive. If you want to hear more about gameplay and how gameplay integrates with the narrative, I do recommend Joseph Anderson's breakdown.
Part 2. Gods and Monster. While God of War's narrative is already pretty sharp, the story gets a lot more complex when we add in all of those sweet, sweet myths. So in the spirit of appreciating as much of this game's story as possible, we're gonna give you all a quick rundown of how this game pulls from real-world mythology. Feel free to skip ahead if this isn't really your thing.
Ever since the first God of War game, when Kratos was just a wee Spartan soldier, he's been a non-stop chaos fountain. In real Greek mythology, there is actually a god named Kratos, a deity of strength personified and a big fan of unnecessary roughness. But aside from those salient qualities, our Kratos doesn't have a lot in common with his namesake. In the first game, he killed Ares and became the god of war. In the second game, he hopped on a revenge quest against Zeus with the help of the Titans. And in the third game, he kills pretty much every man, titan, and god in a 500-mile radius. And that includes killing Athena, the other god of war in Greek mythology, who spends the series as Kratos' divine foil, occasional ally, and secret third-act antagonist. Oh, and to wrap it all up, he also kills himself.
Jump cut to the start of 2018's God of War, where Kratos is alive and in Scandinavia, though we the players don't learn how he accomplished either of those. In fact, Kratos' opening dialogue,
Everything is different, boy. Try not to dwell on it.
implicitly tells the player to just roll with it. What's important to us is that the multiple mythologies in the God of War world do blend together, which we learn most clearly from the character of Mimir, later revealed to be the Shakespearean Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream, and from Tyr's Temple, which has paintings of Norse, Greek, Egyptian, and Japanese deities. But while artistic liberties are clearly at play, the game sticks impressively close to a lot of established Norse mythology.
That said, established Norse mythology consists of 2 books written in Iceland centuries after the area was fully Christianized and literally nothing else, so...
Point taken. And even when they do break from that known canon, the game is extremely clever about how it deviates and why.
Throughout the story, the Norse gods, particularly the Aesir, are portrayed as manic, power-hungry, and extremely violent, which isn't really on brand for the pantheon itself, but lines up pretty well with the previous game's depiction of the Greek gods. So while a character like Baldur is mythologically beloved by the gods and generally seen as an unproblematic fave of goodness and light, God of War keeps the leitmotif while reminding us that in this story, the gods he's beloved by are all terrible people, and he is correspondingly a huge jerk. It also turns his mythical indestructibility on his head. His mother Frigg did magically render him immune to 99.9% of all harm, but it also made him completely numb and drove him majorly bonkers, which is not typically how that plays out in the mythos. At the end of the game, we dip back into real mythology again when Baldur is killed with a mistletoe arrow by Loki. Oh yeah, Atreus is sneakily Loki, we'll touch on that in a second, and Baldur's unexpected death triggers the start of Fimbulwinter, step 1 in the prophesied Ragnarok. That much is true to myth, but the problem for everybody in a 500-mile radius is that Kratos and Atreus triggered Ragnarok a century early. Things may be playing out roughly according to prophecy, but just like the old games, Kratos is a chaotic influence wherever he goes.
This destabilization is first seen in the boss battle against Thor's sons Magni and Modi. The brothers are prophesied to survive into the start of Ragnarok, but when Kratos manages to kill Magni, Modi flips out and asks how, because Modi is operating under the assumption that they're functionally immortal until Ragnarok starts. So he's in total disbelief that Kratos could just break the prophecy like that. Beyond this, it's unclear just how much the gods actually know about Ragnarok, since a lot of the story involves Loki's interference, and by the end of the game, Kratos is the only other person besides Atreus who knows that boy is actually Loki.
Zooming out a bit, the entire Jotunheim sequence reveals a ton about how Kratos fits into the Norse world in an extremely myth-accurate way. The phrases shown at the end of the game label him not as Kratos, but as Farbauti, which I'm definitely not pronouncing right, the canonical husband of Laufey and father of Loki. The only relevant traits of Farbauti in the myths are that he's Loki's dad and that his name means cruel or dangerous striker. This is a brilliant swerve. They take a mythically canon character about which very little is known and slot Kratos right into this role with no narrative contradictions. Kratos is a cruel striker, and his wife Faye, being short for Laufey, makes the rest fit right in.
And this multi-layered reveal was a plot twist to a lot of people, including director Cory Barlog. As it happens, partway through development, the lead writers came up with the idea that Atreus could also be Loki. So they pitched it to Cory, and he was immediately on board. They didn't even have to change the surrounding story, everything just kind of fit. Atreus became Loki, the mom became Laufey, and Kratos became Farbauti. Perfect. Hopping back to how Loki fits into Ragnarok, we learn from Magni and Modi's reactions, as well as Brock and Sindri's argument, that Ragnarok is known well enough to recognize Fimbulwinter as step 1. We also glean from Ymir's stories and the omnipresent ravens that Odin is desperate to avoid Ragnarok and to stop his prophesied downfall because Odin, like Zeus, is power-hungry and terrified of losing his grip on the world. But beyond that, it's tough to see how exactly the next steps of Ragnarok will play out in future games.
This is partially because nobody in-game seems to have the full picture. Odin knows enough to be paranoid as hell, but the giants were the ones who had the full story, and they're all dead by the time the game starts. The only solid looks we get at the coming Ragnarok come from the giants' murals, which show a battle between gods, a really big wolf, and a big dude with a flaming sword who is probably Surtur. But here are some wild cards to look out for. Number 1, in the mythology, it's a huge deal that Odin and Loki swear an oath and become blood brothers, which is the whole reason that Loki, a Jotun and noted pain in the ass, is even allowed to hang out with the Aesir. For our baby boy Atreus to suddenly get buddy-buddy with power-tripping despot Odin would imply some pretty serious stuff going wrong between Kratos and Atreus. Number 2, Jormungandr, the World Serpent, is canonically one of Loki's many children, the other major ones being Fenrir the Wolf and Hel, goddess of Helheim. In the game, Jormi's presence is loosely explained by wibbly-wobbly timey shenanigans, but there's a lot of this relationship left to explore, and no signs of his other 2 children just yet. Number 3, canonically, Odin and Loki's relationship breaks down on account of the Baldur murder being revealed during the flighting of Loki, so Odin imprisons Loki in some very unfortunate snake-related circumstances until he's released for the final battle of Ragnarok. Baldur's already dead, but this event kicks off when Odin learns Loki is responsible, so it's totally possible that Odin doesn't know yet and could do some very nasty things to our boy when he finds out. Other factors to look out for include Heimdall, who's instrumental in Ragnarok because he kills Loki, but we know very little about him in the game. There's also some stuff about how in Ragnarok the sun is supposed to disappear and the earth is supposed to flood, which is conspicuously what happened to Greece when Kratos killed Poseidon and Helios. And Freya swearing vengeance and Kratos' prophesied death are also wildcards to watch out for, but for the sake of time we're going to leave it there.
All in all, God of War does a fantastic job of incorporating real mythology into the story, and even when it goes off script, it's done so darn clever that it actually deepens the lore. Thank you so much for indulging our mythological tangent, and we now resume your regularly scheduled Tim.
Part 3. The side quest problem. So I'm gonna be critical now, I hope you're okay with that, and if you're not, I'm really sorry. God of War is unequivocally a masterful game, but I want to be fair and talk about perhaps my biggest problem with how God of War was written, or structured. You're probably familiar with RPG questlines where your character has a goal to do X, let's say, kill the Dark Lord. But to do that, they need to find a special weapon, giving them goal Y. But to do that, they need to find a map to where the weapon is, goal Z. But to do that, they need ad infinitum. The game will continue to make the previous obstacle conditional on overcoming new obstacles. This kind of storytelling manufactures obstacles between the player and the end goal, usually aimed at lengthening the main quest of the game without too much complexity. And the problem with this, simply put, is that even though the player is doing things, you don't necessarily feel like you're truly moving the story forward. The obstacles don't mean anything to the narrative payoff. They're arbitrary. The result is bad pacing, and this was very much the structure of God of War for me, to the point that I was actively thinking about this problem while I was playing. That's not great. It wasn't even thinly disguised. To demonstrate, let's talk about the broad narrative structure of God of War in terms of goals and obstacles. Firstly, Kratos has a meaningful personal goal, to scatter the ashes of Fae at the top of the highest mountain. But upon reaching halfway up the mountain, we meet our first arbitrary obstacle. The Black Breath blocks your way, and to get through, you need to go to a different world and acquire the Light of Alfheim. Upon doing this, you reach the top of the mountain and you find out that this isn't actually the mountain you needed to go to. Instead, you need to go to Jotunheim on another world, giving you a new obstacle. To do this, you need to get a magical chisel that allows you to activate the portal to it. And upon doing this, a new obstacle arises when Atreus nearly dies and you have to go through Helheim to find the MacGuffin that can heal him. And upon doing this, you finally get to the gates of Jotunheim, where you can scatter Fae's ashes, and the gate is destroyed. You are thrown back into Helheim and a new obstacle is introduced. You have to escape and you have to find a new way to Jotunheim. and upon finding a new way to Jotunheim, you have to find another magical item to activate it, only to have the boss battle kick off with Baldur. See, the problem with this side quest structure where each obstacle becomes conditional on a new obstacle is that overcoming these challenges still doesn't really move the narrative forward. Finding the Light of Helheim to pass through the Black Breath doesn't feel so much like forward progression as it does sideways progression. You're doing something, but going nowhere. Even when you've done it, you still feel like you're in the same place that you were before you got it, quite literally physically in the case of God of War. This is because the goal that means something to your character is continually put on hiatus for these inconvenient obstacles that don't contribute to the emotional or thematic payoff. The three most egregious examples of this are finding the Light of Helheim, finding Mimir's Eye, and finding the Giant's Chisel. They don't mean anything to either Kratos or to the player, especially not emotionally. Even on a very superficial level, these objects don't make us more powerful or really allow us to interact with the game in new ways. You can use the chisel to open secret rooms, but this is a pretty minor part of the game. This is made more frustrating by how the game doesn't pay off a number of its obstacles even when you do overcome them. The most famous example of this is getting to the top of the mountain where you realize that the princess is in another castle, and it is not, in fact, the mountain you were meant to go to at all. The real one is in Jotunheim. I was getting to the top of the mountain, and as I was playing through the game, I was thinking about where the game could go from here. It couldn't possibly be done already. Either A, it would take a long time to ascend the mountain. In fact, I thought, we're going to figure out what happened here in the mountain. That's going to be the mystery of the game. Or B, the game would continue on from scattering the ashes by introducing new stakes. After all, we did have Baldur. These two ideas were the most natural plots for the story to follow. But it was neither. It would have been more efficient to simply have Jotunheim be the aim from the start. I'm not sure what not paying off this obstacle really added to the story. Though Blue did point out to me that this moment suddenly expanded the world and told the player there is so much more to explore, which is worth something, and he pointed out that Mimir provides a lot of narrative depth. The second example I'll touch on is when you finally get the magic chisel and you use it to open the portal to Jotunheim. This is payoff. You get what you were promised after overcoming the obstacle. But then Kratos willingly destroys the portal in combat with Baldur and they are forced to find a new way in. This didn't just feel contrived to me, but I didn't get why the writers did this. I can perhaps understand taking away the emotional catharsis of allowing Kratos and Atreus to scatter Faye's ashes once. But twice? In terms of pacing, it would have been better to have just had more obstacles in Jotunheim itself to get to the peak than it would be to destroy it here. Though, to be fair, I do want to talk about the intersection between creative ambitions and real-world production problems. These criticisms wouldn't be fully balanced without acknowledging them. The writers and directors of God of War did want to do more with these locations than we were given. For example, the giant deathbird thing in Helheim instead of another Technicolor troll. But they didn't have the resources or perhaps the time to do so. A lot of these decisions and pressures are outside the writers and directors' hands, so we've got to be careful when blaming them for these issues. It can come across as a little bit harsh. Now, this doesn't resolve the issues from the player's perspective. They're still there, but there's a wider context to understand when seeing how they came to be. Now, the side quest structure ultimately comes from earlier, less narrative-driven games where the only real medium of engagement was through gameplay. Story was usually a relatively simple framing device that justified the existence of game mechanics and levels. But games have evolved, with many AA games having deep psychological narratives, and the fact that The Last of Us won PlayStation's Game of the Decade is a testament to how gaming is changing. Not that gameplay is necessarily becoming less important, but that narrative is becoming a more integral part of how we engage with a game, and many games are conveying their narrative through gameplay. So these pacing problems can still be reasonably critiqued. I think these challenges of video game narratives are rooted in the difference of medium though. In games, players need to, play. In the case of God of War, they need to hack, to slash, to throw axes and solve puzzles. And the easiest way to make this interesting and diverse is to force players to use the same mechanics against different enemy varieties, or at least in the case of God of War, in different landscapes and different atmospheric conditions with different visuals, which often relies on changes in physical setting, and God of War is no different. The different realms that arise from these side quest obstacles demand unique enemy varieties and visuals, as well as some atmospheric difficulties like Niflheim, where a sickening mist continually saps your health and hides underground enemies. It's where interesting and diverse gameplay can clash with well-written and consistent narratives. But I don't think that these ideas require the side quest structure that God of War eventually settled on. It just makes it harder. It's a more efficient narrative to simply extend one obstacle that the audience is prepared for and immersed in than to create a number of pace-stalling smaller ones. However, it's also understandable that the developers simply wanted to go to some of these other worlds. In that case, it would have been more valuable for players and Kratos to know that they would be going to these different worlds before, say, finally ascending the mountain. For example, if they had asked Kratos to tell 3 other people in 3 different worlds that she had died. This gives him more motivation to go to these worlds, and each world doesn't feel like a pointless obstacle to the overall goal, because they each have their own independent and meaningful goal. And that's the difference. Meaningful. It has an emotional dimension. Now, my focus here on setting and the relationship between world building and the emotional stakes of the story brings us to an issue that builds into this pacing problem. Half of the worlds themselves that you travel to have no real bearing on the developing relationship of Atreus and Kratos, which is, after all, the real story at the heart of it. The rest is just dressing. You travel to Alfheim once, Helheim twice, and Tyr's Temple kind of counts as a world in game. Out of all these 3 worlds though, only one has any real narrative weight to it as a setting: Helheim. Helheim is the land of the dead, the place where you would expect the dead to come back and haunt you in a story about a man who was once a vicious murderer. And they do. Zeus and Athena equally taunt Kratos with his past, providing a unique setting that beautifully fits in with his character arc in the story where he's owning up to his past. It was one of my favourite moments of the game. There's a definitive sense that the physical journey through the world itself is being paired with the emotional journey of the character. There's this wonderful moment where a memory of him attacking his father, Zeus, appears in front of Atreus. The game echoes the violent ending of God of War 3 by putting us in the first-person shot for this, a deliberate choice to take the autonomy from the player and feel the guilt that Kratos does, as we cannot undo nor stop this violence. In a story about fatherhood, having Atreus see this scene was particularly poignant. Likewise, we also see Baldur's past here. The setting plays a crucial role in the development of the story. Compare this to Alfheim, the realm of the Dark and Light Elves, where though Kratos and Atreus interact and continue to learn to trust one another, the setting itself doesn't really factor into this. The closest we get is Kratos remarking on how they should not intervene in the Dark Elf-Light Elf war, because they do not know the full context.
Why are they killing him? He didn't do anything.
Do not assume. You are seeing the end of a war, boy. You do not know what led to this moment.
But he didn't even defend himself.
That was his choice. We make ours.
But this is never expanded upon. It's basically a single scene out of hours of gameplay. They could have made a parallel between those seeking vengeance for past wrongs and Kratos' story in the first 3 games where he hunted down the rest of the gods. Or they could have used this elf conflict to show how Kratos refusing to involve himself in the world isn't always the wisest decision. That he can still do good without losing self-control, that maintaining self-control is not the same thing as passivity, which is what he actually has to teach Atreus. Now, there is a moment at the end where Kratos goes into the light of Alfheim and realizes how Atreus sees him as an angry, distant father who doesn't care. This realization is meaningful and stunningly crafted as a moment of gameplay, and it's followed by a confrontation in the story where he realizes that he was inside the light for hours or perhaps even days while Atreus was left alone. He is forced to confront how distant and emotionless he has been, and how this hurts Atreus for really the first time in the story.
I was gone only... moments.
No! You've been gone a long, long time! I didn't know what to do! You left me here! Again! Why don't you care?
And this is great. This is good storytelling where pressure pushes characters to confront their issues and change. But this doesn't really have anything to do with the world of Alfheim. They don't set up how the light of Alfheim reveals truth prior, nor is there any innate reason we can figure out as to why this happens here inside the light. This could have been placed almost anywhere with just a little bit of exposition. It did, however, naturally happen at the point in Kratos and Atreus' relationship development.
Do not mistake my silence for lack of grief.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize.
No. Why would you? You do not know my ways.
And this is what the story is ultimately about, them learning to understand, love, and trust one another as father and son. But most of the time, this develops as they talk regardless of where they are. The result is that it's kind of like having two people talking in front of a green screen a lot of the time. The dialogue might be great and the character development stellar, but it doesn't really matter what the setting is behind them. And it's the same problem with Tyr's Temple. The relationship between Kratos and Atreus continues to develop beautifully, but the fact that they're in another God of War's secret chamber doesn't really factor into how this relationship develops. Though I do want to remark on him finding the Spartan vase that depicts his past. Easily one of my favourite moments of the game that blends story with setting.
What'd you find?
This doesn't make the development of their relationship weaker, of course. That part of God of War storytelling remains phenomenal. But Helheim and Tyr's Temple makes us care less about what we're doing in these places, because there's no emotional dimension to it, to how we're experiencing this world building. I touched on a tangentially related issue to this before, that the Light of Helheim, the Magic Chisel, and Mimir's Eye don't really mean anything narratively to Kratos or to the player, much like how we care less about the setting and what we're doing there because they aren't tied to the emotions of the story. These items have no emotional dimension either. We wouldn't care if we lose them except because it would be an inconvenience. The Heart of Helheim that Kratos has to acquire is a slightly better example because it's used to revive Atreus, a character we care about deeply, but the item itself doesn't really build into any character arc and it's very quickly discarded. But there is one exception to this, the Blades of Chaos, which he retrieves before going to Helheim. These feel meaningful to retrieve because they have so much narrative weight and history. And it was great that the writers allowed us to acquire them in the way that they did. They didn't just take them for granted. And on this point, I'm going to let Red and Blue talk about why we thought this whole scene was done so incredibly well.
Part 4. Chaos. There's one gigantic counterpoint to the game's side quest structure, and it's during the game's darkest hour where Kratos retrieves the Blades of Chaos. As far as we're concerned, this sequence is when narrative, story, animation, sound design, and gameplay are all simultaneously bringing their A-game.
For context, Atreus has fallen deathly ill for unclear reasons, and Freya says it's because he's having a really bad identity crisis on account of Kratos not telling him he's a god, and the only way to fix him is with a MacGuffin from the icy depths of Helheim. Now, Kratos has fought Hellwalkers before, and his icy Leviathan axe doesn't really work on him, so up until now, Kratos has had to fight them barehanded, which isn't going to work so hot in Helheim, so he needs some firepower. Specifically, his iconic weapon from the first games, the flaming, chain-bound Blades of Chaos. This is real hard for Kratos, because these weapons embody all of his past violence against gods, monsters, humans, and former family members alike. And though they're no longer magically bound to him, the scars are still visible. So Kratos has a clear choice. Take up the blades and confront his awful past, or let his son, and his one chance at being good to somebody for once in his life, die.
With a scowl mean enough to make a lesser man snap, Kratos sets off for home. On his way, he's haunted by visions of Athena, and when he digs up the carefully hidden blades and begins to put them on, she starts taunting him. Since she's in his head, the clear implication is that her accusations are what Kratos thinks of himself. Now, it goes without saying, but Chris Judge's acting for Kratos in this scene is phenomenal. There's just so much raw pathos in the way that he uncovers, approaches, and prepares himself to handle these blades.
Also, this is the only time in the game where we hear that ominous men's choir that was so ubiquitous to the older game soundtracks, and I love it. Anyway, Kratos' response to Athena, that he is a monster but he's no longer her monster, is the change that redirects the entire final act of the story. By taking back the blades, acknowledging his faults, and taking his own advice of do not be sorry, be better, he is only now able to move forward, both physically by going to Helheim and emotionally by accepting himself and saving his son.
This is stellar game design on multiple fronts. Not only does it allow the narrative to progress, but it's a cathartic sequence that develops and deepens the story, and it opens up an entirely new branch of gameplay with the Blades of of chaos. All of the other roadblocks in the game only satisfy that first criterion, but this sequence is so special because it fulfills all three. But there's one last element to this sequence. After Kratos psychologically and symbolically breaks free of Athena's hold, the game hucks a sea of Hellwalkers at the player to show them the ropes with the new weapon. Here, the player learns how the blades work and how Hellwalkers are specifically weak to them. But for some players, especially anyone who remembers the blades from the old games, the feeling of just mowing through a field of baddies is eerily good. It's the gameplay conveying a ghostly remnant of Kratos' old legendary bloodlust. So if most of this game ferries Kratos from one MacGuffin to the other, this super cathartic and pathos-filled sequence represents the total antithesis of that design, where everything works in sync and even a feeling as nuanced as remorseful rage can be conveyed through gameplay. Hats off to Sony Santa Monica for this masterpiece of a scene.
Red and blue are absolutely right here, and the Blades of Chaos clearly hold a big symbolic role in Kratos' story. But I want to ask the question, what is that story exactly? Part 4.
You will always be a monster.
Contrary to what people believe, I don't actually think that God of War was written as a redemption arc for Kratos, at least not in the way that people think. Kratos isn't particularly concerned with redemption for his past crimes. As he puts it,
I killed many who were deserving, and many who were not.
Zuko is perhaps the best redemption arc ever written. It's believable, meaningful, and all-encompassing. This is because Zuko's redemption isn't a shallow sacrifice at the end of a story, but a gradual journey where he organically grows in understanding of himself and the world. He not only realizes why how he hurt people was wrong, but a significant part of the story is dedicated to Zuko working to remedy his past wrongs and mending relationships with the people he hurt, all the while finding new purpose and meaning for himself. If we were to divide good redemption arcs into these two steps, Kratos is really only on this first step for his murder hobo past. He understands and deeply regrets what he did, but he believes himself beyond redemption.
You will always be a monster.
But I am your monster no longer.
Instead, he tries to hide the wrongs of his past from those around him, including Atreus, his son. As a visual manifestation of this, he hides the chain scars around his arms in cloth. Now, the story clearly shows that this was the wrong thing to do, and a large part of the tension in the story is derived from whether Kratos will finally be honest with Atreus about his past. It's rooted in how Kratos was always a distant father to Atreus, to help hide the truth from him to the point of neglecting his son. There are numerous moments of conflict between Kratos and Mimir or Kratos and Freya where he prevents them from saying what they know about him. Atreus even gets physically sick to the point of near death because the secret of his godhood is kept from him. By suppressing the past and truth, Kratos doesn't just harm himself, but he harms those loved ones around him. This is a common technique used in soft magic systems like this, literalizing a metaphorical idea in a magical effect. If anything, the redemption arc in God of War is actually about his mistreatment and neglect of Atreus, hiding the truth, not trusting him, and leaving his son to feel like he doesn't care. It's this that Kratos A comes to understand was wrong, and B works to remedy. Major story beats are him revealing the truth of his godhood and his past. He learns to trust his son, and he actively works to show affection, that he cares for him in a way that he didn't before. To no longer be that distant father. Instead of redemption for his past crimes, Kratos is focused on stopping the cycle of violence with him. He says so explicitly at the end when killing Baldur.
The cycle ends here. We must be better than this.
He desperately wants Atreus to not follow the path he did as a young god.
Who I was is not who you be.
When he shows his chain scars on Jotunheim, this isn't because he's redeemed from the scars of his past, but because he's finally revealing who he fully is to Atreus.
I have nothing more to hide.
This was a beautifully crafted arc, one that's so much more subtle than it usually is, and it's powerful and brilliantly written. This video has been so much fun to create. I don't usually get to make longer form content, especially not on this kind of topic, and it really wouldn't be possible without my patrons. As always, thank you so much. You guys are amazing. You make my job so much easier, and possible. So thank you. Links down below if you want to join that community. What do we have to say about God of War? It's a fantastic game. It's one we recommend playing, and we will certainly be getting the sequels when they come out. It's a simple story that does old tropes well, a kind of testament that not only being new isn't necessarily better, but that creativity and uniqueness can still be found in these old stories. I don't think that anyone would or should call God of War derivative. It's clear how much thought, planning, beauty, and care went into its production, with a mind to be ambitious about quality and not scope. I hope we can see more from these creators, and that the future sequels aren't just a case of bigger and more, but the next chapter of a deeper story. Big thanks to Red and Blue for chilling with me on this video. Their channel is linked down below. They do amazing content. Go check them out. In the meantime, stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.